I've been a truck driver for nearly 20 years, and you could say I've seen it all. I've driven through fog so thick you could slice it, storms that turned the road into a black river, and snow so heavy it felt like I was driving through the clouds. But the thing that happened to me last October, well, nothing in all my years prepared me for it. It was late, just past midnight, and I was hauling a load up Route 37, a stretch of winding road that carves through dense woods in the middle of nowhere. You see, Route 37 has a reputation among drivers. It's not a particularly dangerous road on paper, but people say it has a feel to it, a sense that you're not alone, even when you can't see a single soul for miles. The night was darker than usual. Clouds choked the sky, blotting out the stars, and my headlights barely cut through the murky blackness. The silence inside the cab was almost oppressive, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static on my radio. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd had worse nights on the road. I just gripped the wheel a little tighter, leaned forward, and kept my eyes on the road. About 45 minutes in, things started to get strange. It started with a shadow. I thought it was just the trees at first, the way they lined the road, their branches hanging low and heavy. But as I drove, I noticed that one shadow seemed different. It was a bit taller than the rest, darker somehow, and it didn't seem to move with the sway of the trees. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just tired, but something about it kept pulling my eyes back. Then it moved. I almost didn't believe it at first. It was subtle, like the way you'd see something out of the corner of your eye, but I knew I saw it. The shadow shifted, just a little, almost like it was sliding along the edge of my headlights. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel a chill creeping up my spine. I forced myself to focus, to keep my eyes on the road. But as the miles rolled by, the shadow kept pace with me, sometimes drifting closer to the truck, sometimes hanging back. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was watching me. I could feel it. After about 15 minutes of this, I finally pulled myself together. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the headlights, the trees, and my own exhaustion. I was just about ready to laugh it off when I saw it again. This time it was closer, much closer. The shadow had drifted to the middle of the road, just at the edge of my headlights. It was standing there, tall and still, like it was waiting for me. My fingers clenched on the steering wheel, and I slowed down, squinting to try and make out what it was. That's when I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a person. At least it looked like a person. They were dressed in dark clothes, their face hidden by a hood, and they were just standing there, not moving, right in the center of the road. My foot hovered over the brake, but something inside me screamed not to stop. I don't know why, but I had the strangest feeling that if I stopped, if I got out of the truck, something terrible would happen. So I did the only thing I could think of. I swerved. I veered to the right, just barely missing them. For a split second, I saw their face, or rather, the lack of it. Where their face should have been, there was only darkness, a deep, empty void that seemed to swallow the light from my headlights. I felt a wave of nausea, my skin prickling with cold sweat, and I punched the gas, speeding away as fast as I could. For a few moments, I thought I'd left it behind. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, but the road was empty, the darkness stretching out behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, telling myself it was over. But it wasn't. After a few minutes, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence with a burst of static. I reached over, adjusting the dial, hoping to find some music to calm myself down. But all I got was more static, punctuated by faint, garbled voices that I couldn't quite make out. And then, through the static, I heard my name. It was faint at first, just a whisper, like someone was speaking from far away. Chris. The voice was low, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my hand hovering over the radio, listening as the voice repeated my name, over and over again. Chris, Chris. I yanked my hand away, staring at the radio in horror. The voice was strange, distorted, almost inhuman, and it felt like it was crawling into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts. I wanted to turn the radio off, to pull over and rip it out of the dash, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in that horrible moment as the voice grew louder, more insistent. Chris, why did you leave me? A wave of nausea rolled over me, and I clenched my fists, trying to shake off the feeling. I didn't recognize the voice, but something about it felt familiar, like a memory I couldn't quite grasp. I closed my eyes, taking deep, shaky breaths, and when I opened them, the voice was gone. The radio was silent, the static fading into nothingness. I let out a sigh of relief, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I needed to get off this road, and fast. I drove for what felt like hours, my eyes darting to the mirrors, scanning the darkness for any sign of that figure. The road twisted and turned, each curve more unsettling than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. Finally, I saw a sign for a rest stop up ahead. I pulled off the road, my tires crunching on the gravel as I parked. The place was deserted, the only light coming from a flickering bulb above a rusted bench. I leaned back in my seat, rubbing my eyes, trying to calm myself down, and then I saw it. In the reflection of my side mirror, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, just barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to look, but there was no one there. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, its face, or rather, its faceless void, staring right at me. I scrambled out of the truck, my pulse racing as I backed away, my eyes locked on the mirror. The figure was gone, but the memory of that empty face was burned into my mind. I could still feel its gaze, a cold, hollow sensation that seeped into my bones. I paced around the truck, trying to shake off the feeling, but the silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. Then I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but they grew louder, echoing in the empty parking lot. I froze, my heart pounding as I turned toward the sound. There, standing just a few feet away, was the figure, its face still hidden, its posture stiff and unnatural. "Why did you leave me?" it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind, twisting and turning like a snake. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, and the figure took a step closer, reaching out with a pale, skeletal hand. I stumbled back, my mind racing, desperate to escape. I didn't know what it wanted, didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get away. I climbed back into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it, my hands shaking as I started the engine. But as I looked out the windshield, I saw the figure standing in front of me, blocking the road, its empty face staring into mine. I felt a wave of despair, a crushing sense of hopelessness, and for a moment, I thought about giving up, about letting it take me. But then, something snapped inside me. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening, and I hit the gas, barreling toward the figure with all the speed I could muster. For a split second, I saw it again, saw that empty face staring into mine, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I drove for miles, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, until I finally saw the lights of a town in the distance. I pulled into a gas station, my whole body trembling as I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for air. I told myself it was over, that I was safe. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it's still with me. I stayed in that gas station for hours, sipping on coffee that went cold and staring out the window, half expecting to see that figure standing in the shadows, waiting. The place was empty aside from the clerk, who looked at me funny when I jumped at every small sound. He asked if I was all right, and I just nodded, too afraid of what I might say if I opened my mouth. Eventually, morning came, and the first light of dawn stretched over the horizon. The relief I felt was almost overwhelming, like I'd been holding my breath all night. I figured daylight would make things clearer, chase away whatever darkness had followed me off Route 37. I paid for my coffee, got back in the truck, and took a different route home, one that avoided the past completely. For a few days, everything seemed normal. The memory of that night started to fade, turning into a bad dream that I could dismiss if I didn't think about it too hard. But it wasn't long before the signs started to show up. It began with the mirrors. Every now and then, when I looked at my reflection, I'd catch a glimpse of something just behind me, a dark shape, a shadow that didn't belong. I'd turn around, heart racing, but there was never anything there. And it wasn't just the mirrors in my house. I'd see it in shop windows, in the rearview mirror of my truck, even in the water when I splashed my face in the sink. Each time, it seemed a little closer, a little clearer. That dark figure, its face, or rather its lack of a face, staring back at me from the corner of my vision. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I ignored it, the worse it got. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, easy to brush off. I'd be lying in bed, half asleep, when I'd hear my name, soft and distant, like a breath of wind in my ear. I'd sit up, heart pounding, but the room would be silent, empty. I told myself it was just the house settling, just my imagination. But then it got louder. I'd be walking through the grocery store or sitting in traffic, and I'd hear it, a low, distorted whisper, calling my name. Chris, it would echo in my mind, twisting and stretching, like it was coming from somewhere far away, or from right inside my head. And every time I heard it, the words would be the same. Why did you leave me? The words haunted me, echoing in my thoughts even when I couldn't hear them. I tried to remember if there was anyone I'd left behind, anyone I'd hurt, but nothing made sense. The voice didn't feel human. It felt like something else, something ancient, something that wanted me to feel guilty, afraid. And it was working. The last straw came a week later, when I was back on the road. I was driving late again, trying to make it home before midnight, when my radio crackled to life. The static was loud, filling the cab with that familiar, eerie hum, and I reached over to turn it off. But before I could, I heard it. Chris. The voice was so clear, so close, that it felt like someone was sitting right next to me, whispering in my ear. My hands went ice cold, and I gripped the wheel, my knuckles turning white. Why did you leave me? The voice asked, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't respond. I didn't even breathe. I just kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look to my right, where the voice had come from. I knew, somehow, that if I looked, I'd see it. That figure, sitting in the passenger seat, staring at me with its empty, hollow face. The voice grew louder, more frantic, until it was almost shouting. Why did you leave me, Chris? Why did you leave me alone? And then, in a flash of clarity, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. It was my brother. When we were kids, I'd had a little brother named Danny. We were close, inseparable even. One day, when we were about 10, we'd gone into the woods behind our house to play, just the two of us. We got lost, wandering deeper and deeper until the trees all started to look the same, and I couldn't find my way back. Danny started to cry, saying he was scared, saying he wanted to go home. And me? I was angry. I blamed him for getting us lost, even though it was my idea to go into the woods. So, when we finally found our way to a clearing, I told him to stay put, that I was going to find help. I promised him I'd be right back, but I didn't come back. I got scared, too, and I ran home without him. By the time my parents realized Danny wasn't with me, and we went back to look, he was gone. They found him the next morning, huddled under a tree, frozen to death. He'd stayed in the clearing, just like I'd told him to. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt a wave of nausea, a sharp, horrible guilt that twisted in my stomach. I hadn't thought about Danny in years. My family never spoke of him after that day, never blamed me outright, but I'd blamed myself, buried the memory so deep that I'd almost forgotten it. But he hadn't forgotten. Danny hadn't forgotten. The voice on the radio was silent now, and I took a shaky breath, glancing to my right. And there he was, a small, shadowed figure, sitting in the passenger seat, staring at me with empty, hollow eyes. His face was pale, his lips blue, and I could see the faint traces of frost clinging to his skin, like he was still trapped in that cold, endless night. Why did you leave me, Chris? He whispered, his voice a broken echo, filled with pain, with betrayal. I'm sorry. I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. Danny, I'm so sorry. But he didn't respond. He just stared at me, his empty eyes drilling into mine, and I knew he was never going to leave. I'd left him to die, abandoned him in the woods, and he'd been waiting all these years for me to come back, to finally face what I'd done. Now he was here, with me, a shadow I could never escape. When I looked back at the road, the truck was veering toward the edge of the cliff. I yanked the wheel, trying to steer back, but it was too late. The last thing I saw was Danny's face, watching me, his eyes as empty and cold as the night he died.